Good afternoon, everyone, and welcome to this virtual professional development opportunity. My name is Joe Schmidt, and I'm the Social Studies Specialist for the Maine Department of Education. Today, our featured speaker is Stephanie Wager. She is I think it's Social Studies Consultant, right? Is that your formal title? At the Iowa Department of Education. She is also the current president of the National Council for the Social Studies, and a good dear friend of mine, for we were just chatting before we started to record, for about 7 or 8 years. We're trying to remember exactly how long it's been. Stephanie, if you pay attention to the social studies world right now, because of her role in the National Council for the Social Studies, you will see her in all sorts of different webinars, social media pieces, interviews and stuff, really again, serving as that face of social studies for the council, for the National Council for the Social Studies. And we are lucky to have her here today as she talks about best practices in social studies. So at this point, I will turn it over to Stephanie.
All right, thank you so much, Joe. And that, I don't know, put extra weight on my shoulders for the presentation today. The first thing I'm just gonna say is just logistically, we're gonna use Pear Deck today. If you're not familiar with Pear Deck, this allows you to just be able to see the slides, but also have some interactivity, which I particularly love doing webinars because it's just a nice way for me to kind of check for understanding and for you to have that interactivity. So if you go to joinpd.com and you type in the code that you see on your screen, that should allow you to connect to the slides. And I'll just pause for a minute while everyone's getting connected. And then there will be some times during the webinar today that we'll have kind of a processing question or a kind of a little stop and say, you know, are you understanding, and that kind of thing. And Pear Deck will allow us to do that. So I'm gonna just wait for folks to get connected, and then we'll go ahead and get started. And let me know if you're having trouble too, because it looks like nobody has joined yet. Oh, I spoke too soon. Somebody has joined. Thank you. Okay, about 10 more seconds and I'll go ahead and get started. If you aren't connected yet, the code that you see there will be up in the right-hand corner of the slides as well. So I'll go ahead and hit start, and we'll get kicked off here. I think Joe will also link this in the chat box, but if you are not, if not, then I also wanted to point you to this bit.ly link. bit.ly/ss-lev is the shortened link for the folder that I put not only the slides in, but a few other things that kind of accompany today's webinar. So I'll give you just a minute to hop into that bit.ly, because I know one of the biggest questions I get is always, am I going to have access to these slides? And so I want to comfort you and answer that question up front, that you will have access, and they are right there. So I will go ahead and get started again, because I think Joe's going to put that link into the chat box. I'm going to skip this slide for time's sake today, but I want to start off with this quote, and I think it's really profound, at least for why I feel passionate not only about social studies, but the topic we're going to talk about today in terms of high leverage strategies. So I will read this to you just because of the nature of the quote. Democratic societies rely on high-quality social studies instruction, cultivating students who delve deeper into issues and problems that vex humankind. I just really love that quote. I think it's just such a profound quote, and really sending that message that although sometimes people think of social studies as the easy class, you know, I've heard so many people comment, you know, social studies is the easy class, right? You do worksheets, you answer questions from the end of the book. And this is such a profound quote to say, actually, that's not what social studies should be. And it's so important that it is not that, because of really cultivating not only our current citizens, but the future citizens that really impact our world. So I think of this quote as I think about kind of these high leverage strategies that we're going to talk about today. So I also think about all of the things that connect with instruction, which we're going to primarily be talking today about. What are those instructional strategies that are really effective in advancing social studies learning? And around instruction, we see standards, we see curriculum, we see assessment, and all of these things really work together in a way that hopefully elevates instruction. But for today's purposes, we will focus on what are those instructional strategies that are really effective in advancing standards, curriculum, and assessment. So I did not make up this term, high leverage practices. This definition that you see in front of you, I did adapt from teachingworks.org. But there are a couple other really great resources for thinking about high leverage practices. And one of them that I would really suggest you check out if you haven't is the book that you see on your screen, Visible Learning for Social Studies. This is a relatively new book. It's, I think it came out in maybe May or June. It was sometime in the spring. And it's, I think, the last one in the series from John Hattie's work, Visible Learning. He now has, well, him, I should say, and a few other authors have a series of books. So there's a Visible Learning for math and for science, et cetera. And social studies is kind of the last published book in that series. So these high leverage practices are really like the fundamentals of teaching, but they're practices that should be constantly used and are critical to helping students learn important skills and content. And I think that's important when we think about that diagram that I just showed you, really focus on instruction and those things that can really be used to leverage high quality standards, curriculum, and assessment. So before we dive into what are these high leverage strategies that we're going to be talking about, I do want to say that all of them that we're going to be talking about today have an effect size of at least 0.4 or greater. And why I point this out, and many of you are probably familiar with effect size, and it's probably not a new piece of information. But effect size really, when we think about research, we want to see an effect size of 0.4 or greater, because that's the strategies that's going to have the most desired effects to actually accelerate student learning. We don't want to see anything really below that, because even though it may have some effect, it's really not going to have as much of an effect as we want it to have. And so all the strategies we're going to talk about today have that high leverage, high effect size of 0.4 or greater. So the book that I shared with you, Visible Learning for Social Studies, what I really liked about this particular book and thinking about these high leverage practices was the fact that the authors, I should say, really divided these strategies into two buckets. And one was surface level and the other was deep level learning. And so we'll talk a little bit more about the differences between those, because sometimes we think of surface level and we think, oh, maybe that's, not where we want to be. But there's lots of great research about how we have to really have both surface and deep level learning to be able to understand and to get into deep level and like that transfer of learning. And so we'll talk a little bit about that later. But I want to just pause for a second and give you a chance to look at the practices that you see on your screen. And the other thing I would point you to is linked in this slide is a direct link to an overview document that I created that just gives a little bit of a definition about each one of these particular practices. So I'll pause for just about 20 seconds and give you just a second to look over and kind of process through those surface and deep level practices that you see on your screen. Okay, so I always am someone who believes that it is not okay to present to educators and assume that they're doing none of these things already. I'm sure many of you are using these high leverage practices already. We, of course, later today will be talking more about what are the implications for these strategies in social studies specifically, because you may have noticed that some of these like note taking. Well, note taking doesn't just happen in social studies, as an example. So we'll talk a little bit about that later. But I want you to take just a minute in your Pear Deck slides. And again, you should be able to type right on your slide and identify which of these high leverage practices you currently use or see being used if you're not currently in the classroom but are working with social studies teachers. So I'm going to take about 30 seconds, maybe 45 seconds, see where we are, and then we'll come back and talk about this. Okay, about 10 more seconds. Okay, and this is why I love Pear Deck, right? Because I can click and see the thinking of each one of you and responding to that question. So just a couple pieces we'll share here. Surface level, teacher modeling, note taking, vocabulary, deep level, metacognitive, close reading and feedback, all surface level practices and all but reciprocal teaching, close reading, discussion, feedback, all surface level. Okay, so we'll talk a little bit about that throughout the day and kind of, again, thinking about those implications for social studies as we think about this question of which practices do we currently use or see being used. So I like to think of surface level as kind of like the shallow end of the pool, and why I think of it in that way is, again, I think sometimes when we hear surface level, we think, oh, it's not really important, or we should skip over this because it's kind of low level learning. But I think of the analogy of the shallow end of the pool. If I were learning to swim, I would hope that people wouldn't throw me into the deep end. And I think the same is true for thinking about how we would use these strategies. So in a given unit, let's say, I might use both surface and high level, or I'm sorry, deep level strategies as it is appropriate for what I'm trying to teach, right? So we'd want to see both surface level and deep level strategies as it makes sense, because if not, we're skipping to that deep end when students are perhaps not ready to go there. And maybe they don't understand concepts yet, maybe they haven't had that processing needed. And so it's really important that we think about kind of not throwing them into the deep end and thinking about the purposes of the shallow end with those surface level strategies. So here are those surface level strategies again, just to kind of jog your memory. We're going to talk about a few of these today. We're not going to talk about all of them, but one that I particularly want to just mention is leveraging prior knowledge. And I'm mentioning it now because I think, at least in my world, there was so much discussion about how do we ensure as students are coming back with potential learning loss from being maybe not in school or not in school in the traditional way in the spring. How do we catch them up, right? And so one of the reasons, in fact, I put together this presentation was to think about using strategies as a way to accelerate learning, rather than trying to say we're going to cram all sorts of, kind of extra facts in and hope that students get caught up that way. But when we think about leveraging prior knowledge, why I bring that up is because that's another way that we want to really use what students hopefully already know to help them make sense of new information. And so we're not going to talk a lot about that today, but I think it really plays a part in the conversation about lost learning from last spring or lost learning right now. And you will have access to all of these slides. So if you want to go back to that one, you can certainly do that. So teacher modeling for me is super important, and especially in social studies, because what I want you to think about when we think about teacher modeling are all of those like discipline specific practices that students would not necessarily come to us knowing, right? And so the idea that teachers would model and model consistently how to do that is really, really important. And sometimes I've worked with teachers or been in, a department with my colleagues, and they're like, we don't need to teach them how to, analyze a primary source. They should already know that. Like, they should already know how to write. Like, we don't need to do that. And I'm here today to say that that is not true. Oftentimes, students come to us not knowing how to do some of these discipline specific practices. And so we really have to think about how can we model that and model it over time and take away those scaffolds over time. I think about this as like the think aloud, right? So if I'm teaching students to analyze a primary source, I really want to make sure that I'm first doing that so that I'm really showing them my thinking about how I would process the primary source and different kinds of sources too. So I'm not just, modeling one kind of analysis. And then again, I'm really thinking about that gradual release of, which I'm sure you're all familiar with, of first I do as the teacher, second we do together, third you do together, and fourth you do by yourself. And so thinking of the unit of instruction and thinking about the whole year, right? I may pull away those scaffolds a little bit within the unit, but I'm going to continue to pull away those scaffolds, hopefully at least throughout the year. One other thing that I think is important when I think about teacher modeling, and this is linked in your slide, is to have a really specific way. As an example, if I were annotating primary sources, to have a specific way that students should do that, or ask them to create a specific way or structure that they should do that when annotating primary sources, so that you can always see their thinking in doing that annotation. And so I just linked the document that I used when I was in the classroom, so you get kind of a general idea of what I'm talking about when I say annotating primary sources. And here's a little snapshot of it. You probably can't see it super well up in the corner there, but thinking about teaching students, if they come across quotes, to maybe put those in brackets, quotes that are significant. If they come across a statistic, maybe put the pound sign. If they identify something, that's new vocabulary, maybe we're going to underline it, or an aha, maybe we're going to put an exclamation point. So there's a specific structure that I'm modeling when I do that teacher modeling, so that I know as the teacher and they know as the learner what that structure looks like. The other thing I did here, hoping that it would be helpful for you, is really to break apart what this could look like in both an in-person setting and a virtual setting. And so really similar learning here. This is a second grade example. They're examining the question of what makes a good leader. The teacher is really choosing one of the images that relate to being a good leader and doing that think aloud about what they see in the image and identifying the things in the image that specifically sort of call out being a good leader. And really similar process over in virtual learning, but maybe the teacher is showing their thinking on something like a Jamboard in that regard, rather than displaying it on a whiteboard or something like that in an in-person setting. So that's just a brief overview of teacher modeling as it sort of specifically we think about it in relation to social studies. But I use the annotating primary sources example of what you might want to model, but there's so many things within our discipline that that we'd really want to unpack to make sure that students understand that thinking within social studies. The next one is graphic organizers, and that again is probably a really common thing that each of you use or see being used. And I think the key here, a couple of keys at least that I would say, is number one, using the right graphic organizer for the task. And so not just using anything, right, but using specific graphic organizers for the learning that I'm trying to take place. And I think the other thing, connecting back to teacher modeling, you're going to see me kind of hopefully connect the dots between some of these strategies, is when you're introducing a new graphic organizer, really modeling that thinking of how would I think about and complete this graphic organizer effectively. And then the other like really strong thing that I know I did not do a great job of as a classroom teacher was really that processing of the graphic organizer and coming back to it throughout the unit, rather than just seeing it as something like students just complete, they fill out and they turn it in, but there's not necessarily that consistent like coming back to the graphic organizer. So I think those three things are really in the research about what's high leverage about using graphic organizers. You have to have those kind of ingredients to make the use of graphic organizers successful. So here you see an example of using a FRAIR model, and this kind of will also intersect with our piece on vocabulary. So I love using the FRAIR model. It's one of my favorite vocabulary strategies. And many teachers use that in social studies to kind of break apart and look at examples and non-examples of social studies related words. But if I were doing that in a virtual setting, I could throw that on a Jamboard or a Padlet or something like that, where we were all kind of contributing to that graphic organizer at once. But again, I want to come back to that throughout the unit to make sure we're really processing that learning. So I want to just pause right here, check for understanding. So you should be able to drag your dot to one of those desks, keep going, I'm a little confused, or stop, I need help. So just take about 20 seconds to drag your icon. Okay, looks like everybody is understanding so far. Thank you for that, that's helpful for me. So I'm going to talk about a couple more under surface level learning, and one is wide reading. Now, although sometimes we think about social studies and some people just equate social studies with textbooks, I want to try to move us away from that idea, because wide reading is something that the research has a really high effect size when we are using wide reading and using it effectively. And it goes along so well with the nature of social studies. So teachers should always ask students to engage with a wide variety of texts. And many of you are probably familiar with kind of the expanded version of when we say text. We're not just talking about written text, we're talking about images, songs, cartoons, political cartoons, I should say, predominantly maps, all of those kinds of things, anything that really gives us, information, right, that we're trying to make sense of within the inquiry that we're using. And so really important for social studies, but really also an important high leverage practice in terms of just student engagement and in interacting with multiple kinds of text, and also has a really high effect size to be able to do this. So let's look at this quick example. This is just a snapshot from an IDM inquiry. And I want to draw your attention to the bottom here where it shows featured sources. And what I want you to look at, even though you can't see the sources themselves, you can kind of make some inferences about the kinds of sources that students are accessing. So I want you to take about 30 seconds and just look at those sources and see what you can glean from what students are reading in this particular inquiry. All right. Hopefully you were able to glean there was a lot of different kinds of reading. So if I start over here, excerpt from the Sugar Barons, excerpt from Sugar and Slavery. I don't know just from these titles if this is fiction, nonfiction, but I can, I can see that we're already reading some excerpts related to the inquiry. I can see a map here, an image bank, another image bank over here. This Sugar Love, I'm guessing it might be a fiction story, but maybe not. Here, I know excerpt from the interesting narrative of the life of Olinda Equiano. I know and am familiar with that, so I can see the kind of sources that students are accessing here, and another source bank of descriptions of work on a sugar plantation. So students, this is, I believe it's a 5th grade inquiry. So just students in this one example, right, are reading and accessing a wide variety of different kinds of text related to the supporting questions that students are wrestling with in the inquiry. So wide reading is, we really want to see that wide variety of texts within the given inquiry. So a couple more here on surface level learning, and some of you commented about note taking when we first asked, what strategies do you see already, and or do you already use? And I think note taking sometimes, and I'm guilty of this myself, gets a bad rap a little bit. But note taking, and I should say effective note taking, has an effect size of 0.51. Which is really high and much higher than certainly I thought it was when I was first putting this strategy, or this PowerPoint, excuse me, together. I think like many of the strategies we've already looked at, though, the devil is in the details, right? And so the research suggests that only with effective note-taking, where students are really being asked to reflect and synthesize the information, do we see that effect size. And so, of course, many of you might be familiar with the Cornell method, where you have a note-taking, kind of a classic note-taking part of that, but you also have oftentimes on the left-hand side, kind of a cue column where students are synthesizing that information, identifying key words, key questions that they're being asked to think about, and then a summary or a synthesis at the bottom. So we're really using the notes to process information and coming back to, you'll probably see that theme too, coming back to those notes throughout the unit. And you can see here some examples of what could this look like in person versus what might this look like in some kind of virtual environment. So always thinking about these strategies as the importance is really how we use them, and not just thinking about note-taking in general. Like I said, devil's in the details, right? And the last surface level strategy that I'll talk about is vocabulary instruction. I'm sure Joe would tell you the same thing, because we're always kind of preaching this, but approximately 55% of the words that a student encounters throughout their K-12 education come from social studies. And the reason why I wanted to make sure that we emphasize vocabulary instruction as we're thinking about high leverage practices is because of that fact, right? That so much of the words that a student encounters comes from social studies. And effective vocabulary instruction has an effect size of 0.63, so even higher than note-taking. And I think that's the highest of all of those surface level strategies. The other thing I always like to say is academic standards can be really a good starting place for helping teachers identify what are those words that students would need to know to be able to effectively meet this standard. Now, I want to just say that's a starting place because there's lots of other things that you'd want to consider, like the kinds of text you're asking students to read. Certainly you'd want to pull out those words as well. But just in this example, this is a 5th grade standard. Just pause for about 10 seconds and think about, if I were a 5th grade student, what words would I want to make sure as the teacher that students have a good understanding of before trying to meet that standard. So I'll pause for just 10 seconds so you can read that particular standard. Okay, so this one isn't like super complex, but certainly restrict could be a tricky word. Human population, even movements could be movements used in this way certainly could be. So again, just thinking about the words that we see in our standards, and certainly the words that we would encounter in text that we're asking students to read. And think back to the graphic organizer piece that we talked about earlier with the FAIR model, because that's a really effective way to teach vocabulary. And I've also linked in here Marzano's 6 steps to effective vocabulary instruction. But you would want to make sure that you're picking some of those strategies that have that still have that high effect size, like the FAIR model, and are using those to teach the vocabulary words that you're asking students to wrestle with. Okay, so I want you to just kind of think holistically of what we've talked about already, and think about what sort of squared with your thinking, what made sense, what was already something you knew, but what questions are still sort of circling in your head? So you should be able to write right on this slide. So let's take about a minute to do this. Okay, it looks like most responses are in. Um, I love the first one. Oh, I know Cornell notes are good, but hated doing them as a student. And I wonder if that's because they're just harder, or you just didn't like that format. It would be a question I would have, and I agree that I have been asked to do them too. I haven't come across it. I would love if anybody on the webinar has some great suggestions. That is oftentimes, if you're digging into the research about effective strategies for note taking, that is the one consistently that comes up. And so I would love to hear if there are any others that people know about. But yes, think it was harder, forced your thinking. What strategies can we use to teach students the background knowledge they need to move on? I think for that one, I guess my question kind of back would be, how do we sort of assess what students already know so that we know what we can build upon? I think would be one kind of step before that, that we'd want to think about, and then thinking about how do we really build and capitalize upon that. Sometimes it is a little bit trickier, I think, depending upon where you are in terms of elementary versus secondary, because sometimes at the secondary level there isn't as much of a content connection with the previous grade level, but certainly there are oftentimes, depending on how your standards are set up, is often a big skills progression that sometimes I think is a little bit ignored, and so we want to make sure that we're also building upon that aspect of background knowledge. All of it, time to do all of it during remote teaching. Yeah, I mean, certainly don't feel like, I hope with anything like this, you can take a nugget, but No pressure to take all of this and try to implement it tomorrow by any means. So thank you for those responses. Let's take just a little bit of time then to talk about then some of those deep level, high leverage strategies. And I'm sure at some point I'm going to get tongue tied with that. So going along with our shallow end of the pool analogy here, we think of these as the deep end of the pool. And at some point, when I'm learning to swim, I had to get comfortable with the deep end, but I was gradually, thankfully, worked up to the deep end. It's a similar concept here. And I loved this quote, another one from Visible Learning for Social Studies. The revelation that the world is more complex than one previously thought is a hallmark of deeper social studies learning. And I just thought that was such a great quote. I don't know what any of you think, but again, going back to that idea that sometimes people that I encounter think that social studies is really easy, and of course, sometimes my response is, if it were easy, the world would be a perfect place, right? And so, really challenging that idea that it's not easy, it's actually really complex, and we have to help students like wrestle with that complexity. So a reminder about what these deep level strategies are, and we're not going to talk about all of these today, but we will touch on a few of these. And I think these are all things that for the most part we're pretty familiar with. Reciprocal teaching, I think I see sometimes, but I think that would probably be like the least maybe popular one out of the list. But I see these others pretty frequently. I think the question sometimes is, have we built up those skills within surface level learning for students to be successful in deep level learning? And so just something to think about there, and what's the interplay between each of those. So we're going to look first at close reading, and I want you to think about kind of this overlap with wide reading that we talked about in surface level learning. So close reading, probably very familiar with it, really asks students to engage in repeated reading of a short passage. Now, when I think about this from a social studies lens, I think of a couple things. Number one, sometimes the term is used in literacy that we're looking for an anchor text. So when I thought about my collection of primary and secondary sources that students are going to engage with in the unit, what is like a key document that I think is like foundational for the unit that I want students to engage in close reading around. So that was like my thinking as a teacher. Certainly doesn't have to be your thinking for this. But the idea in social studies, and what I really like about this 4 reads that you see on your screen, is that it's social studies specific. And this was developed by teachinghistory.org. There's a hyperlink there, so feel free to go there and grab it. But essentially, students read the document the first time for the origins and context of the document. They do a second reading, and I'll stop right there for just a second and back up. As they're doing this reading, they're annotating. So think back to our teacher modeling piece that we talked about for surface level. And they're annotating for each of these reads as they're doing them. The second read then is reading for meaning. The third read is reading for author's argument. And the fourth read is sort of putting that all together and reading like a historian would read. And so I just love this. You don't have to follow this 4 reads strategy. It's just one example of close reading. But I think no matter what, you're going to want to do teacher modeling of what does close reading look like. And you're going to want to have some kind of lenses by which students are doing the close reading as they're doing it. Here is an example. Again, you can see the annotating primary sources piece, but if, let's say, I were teaching about women's suffrage, and a key document, at least in my mind, would be the Declaration of Sentiments. And so normally I don't like all this text on one slide, but just to model, you might have a short excerpt from the Declaration of Sentiments. And as students are reading it each time, they're looking for these different kind of lenses of the document and annotating each time. And of course, then the key after that, right, is what do you do then with that information? Like, what's the purpose of them reading it? So really going back and processing through what did students get out of reading the document 4 times? So you may have some processing questions. Maybe it leads into a class discussion about something, but really you want to make sure then you're doing something purposeful around that close reading. Okay, so wow, this was like planted here, class discussions, imagine that. So the big key with class discussions, and it's super critical, of course, in any social studies classroom, we want to see class discussion. We want to make sure, however, that we're making that distinction between discussion and sort of students answering one-off questions. So the research suggests that effective class discussions are those in which really the students are facilitating the conversation or the discussion. And not that the teacher isn't facilitating, but they're really kind of on the side, right? They're making sure nothing is going awry. They may be facilitating, some of the conversation, but students are really the ones who are leading the conversation, and being the drivers of that conversation. So in order to get the effect size of 0.48, that's what you need to see. Those are the characteristics of an effective class discussion. And there are so many really great strategies out there around what are some frameworks for effective classroom discussions. I linked some here in the document. One of my favorites, and I feel like a lot of people don't know about it, is called Socratic Smackdown. So it's based off of, let me just go to the next slide and you can see a little bit of the text here. It's based off of the idea of a Socratic seminar, but it's sort of been gamified. And so students get points for, you can hopefully see a little bit on your screen, for each of these sort of moves that they can have during the discussion. So if they agree, so for example, I agree and then I provide evidence to build on my argument, I get 1 point. But I can also lose points if I interrupt, if I insult somebody, if I try to distract somebody. So you can kind of see here how the game is played, and that's one of my favorites because it kind of incentivizes students to lead the conversation, and it has some of that reflection piece built into it. The other thing that I really love is somebody had this wonderful video about hand signals that you can use, and you could use via Zoom or an in-person discussion to show agreement or not agreement with whatever points that certain students are trying to make about the text that they're reading, and do it in a way that's not distracting, right? So if I agree, I'm holding up a 1 or whatever system that you set up in your own classroom. So I really love all the things that are out there around having effective discussion. But again, think about this one in connection to some of the other ones, in connection to close reading, to wide reading, because of course you're going to want to have multiple documents that students are pulling evidence from to be able to effectively discuss. Lots of great connections between some of these particular high leverage strategies. Okay, so a couple last ones as we kind of close out here. I'm being cognizant of my time. The use of metacognitive strategies has an effect size of 0.55, so it's another really high one. And this is really just asking students or getting students to think about their thinking. It's certainly not only specific to social studies, but there are a couple resources in social studies that I think most social studies teachers are familiar with that really help support this idea of metacognition. And one is the question formulation technique that really asks students to generate questions, but also process their thinking about those questions when they identify whether they are open questions or closed questions, and then they go back and try to improve those questions, is one way that you can get students to think about their thinking. So really critical in any class, but certainly in social studies, there's so many things that you want to really ask students to process their own thinking about. Why do you say that? And one of those ways could be the QFT. Reciprocal teaching, I'm not going to talk about today because I think it's not as often used in a social studies classroom, but I do think it provides a good structured routine that could be really helpful in working through text passages. And it has, it has a pretty high effect size. The last one I'm going to end with is feedback, which I struggle with this one, or certainly struggled with this one, I think, in the classroom, because this is one of the more timely things oftentimes. But it does have a very high effect size of 0.66. So when done effectively, and I've since seen so many creative ways to give feedback, like the audio feedback now in Google Docs and things like that. And I'm like, oh, I wish I would have thought of that. That seems so much easier than, writing everything out. And so there are some easier ways to think about giving feedback than were at least available when I was in the classroom. And so feedback categories, we want to just kind of think about feedback about the task, about the process, self-regulatory feedback, and then feedback about self are just some of the ways that we kind of delineate thinking about feedback. And one of the things I think about, and I'm sure you have too, is just how much I think we don't bat an eye at giving feedback. Like if you're in fine arts or if you're in sports, my coaches and my choir director was giving me feedback all the time, and I didn't really bat an eye. And so that is something certainly I think would be I would work on this if I were back in the classroom for myself as a improvement category, because I know it is very critical for student learning. So I want to close kind of addressing this whole idea that I think so many schools have wrestled with this year, at least schools that I work with, and I think schools across the country, and really why I was kind of inspired to put this presentation together, because of that talk, right, about how do we catch students up. And so this graphic from Unbounded, you may be familiar with them, I thought was really well done in kind of thinking about how we can maximize grade level teaching, but also think about it from kind of an equitable approach. And I think it's a good also way to think about all of these different high leverage strategies and how we can think about them not just kind of crammed into something, but really spread out and purposeful as it makes sense for our learning context and certainly our students. So the first graphic you see is certainly where we were last spring. A typical approach to responding to that might be, okay, jam Q4 on top of at the beginning of the school year. But we really want to think about this equitable approach to, again, think about what do students already know? What do they not know? Where are those gaps of thinking about our standards, and really spreading that out with support throughout the year. And I would add leveraging these high leverage instructional strategies in order to do that. So we're not just sort of cramming in content. And I'm not saying any of you are doing that, but it was something that was certainly a question in the summer and into the early fall. And hopefully this was a little bit helpful in thinking about how we might use these strategies to really address this issue that we're all dealing with this particular year. So again, don't need to spend a ton of time on this, but I did create a unit and lesson plan template that you have linked in your folder that really calls out some of these strategies to just kind of offer that reminder if you were filling out a unit or lesson plan, like, oh, I need to be mindful of like, where am I putting in these particular high leverage strategies, since we know that they are highly effective in advancing student learning. You can use that or not use that, but hopefully that's helpful for you, and that's in your folder. The other thing I want to say is we didn't talk about this at all today, but I think another really important thing to keep in mind in terms of high leverage strategies is that relationship between student and teacher. When students feel recognized, when students feel valued, and you all know this, they have a much better experience in the classroom. And so I love when I see the really amazing work that all the folks are doing with their Bitmoji classrooms, when students see themselves reflected in that, and see teachers building those relationships with students, that goes right along with these high leverage instructional strategies. So I want to just, we have like 3 minutes left, so I'll give you 1 minute to just think about what is kind of a big takeaway from today's webinar. If you had to summarize that, just what's the most important thing you're going to walk away with? So I'll pause for just a minute here. Okay, I'm going to go ahead and open that back up. Give you just a minute. Looks like people are still working, sorry. Okay, I think I see some thinking starting to take shape here, so I'll go ahead and read a few of these. Just a takeaway of the importance of putting more emphasis on the deep level practices. Gosh, so much. I think I might bring those last 2 slides to PLC's Friday. Remembering Unit 4, not crammed into Unit 1. We've been talking about gap analysis where we can spread around the gaps. I think that's a great approach. The outline of surface versus deep categories along with details and examples. I would love to be able to have the interactive slides while presenting / modeling note taking. Yeah, thanks so much for sharing that, and hopefully there were some good takeaways here. If you liked the Pear Deck, feel free to add that to if you use Google Slides. I really love using Pear Deck, and gives you a lot of different options when presenting too. And I'll just leave with are there any questions other than just what we've shared throughout the webinar today?
Yes, Lisa, this presentation is in that folder, and I have linked it onto the professional learning page as well. So as soon as I process the video will be available. The presentation is currently already available, and so is the folder.
Yep. Thank you, Joe.
Mm-hmm.
And I saw Emily shared doodle notes. I'm gonna have to check that out. I clicked on that, so I'll check that out later. If anyone has any other good ones besides our lovely Cornell notes, yeah, send them our way. So unless Joe has a good one, that's like the main one I see constantly used when you're reading an article about effective note taking. All right, any other questions?
Any questions for Stephanie? You're in the room where it's about to happen. The smartest person in the room is here taking questions. Here's your chance.
You're so funny. Too funny.
Last call. Any questions?
Well, thank you everyone for being here today, and hopefully this was helpful, and I hope everyone has a wonderful day.
Awesome. Thank you, Stephanie.
Thank you.